Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. Now, before I get started on today's case, I just want to mention it is super controversial. It has sparked a ton of different conspiracy theories, accusations, all of the things. And even though the story seems like it should be over, a lot of people think that it's just the beginning. Like, it might not be as solved as you would think. So I am really curious to know what you guys think about this one. Make sure you're commenting as we go, but then at the very end, I want to know what you think as well. So without further ado, let's just kind of dive right in. Get ready with me to go to bed. I'm already in my jammies. I start my bedtime routine around 7:30 because I like to be asleep by 8:30. Now, I wear my Oura Ring every single day because not only does it track my habits, but it tracks my sleep, which I absolutely love. And I'm able to see when I'm getting a good night of sleep versus a horrible garbage trash night of sleep. Now, part of my bedtime routine is once I shower, once I have my pajamas on, I go and I make my Beam Dream sleep tea. I have been doing this religiously for like well over a year now. I can't live without it. However, the other night I did forget to take it, and you can see my sleep score was in the trash. Then I got back on track, and you can see my sleep score was back to where it should be. I always had a very difficult time getting a good night of sleep because I'm somebody who wakes up, I think about things, I can't fall back asleep. But when my husband introduced me to Beam, it changed my life completely. So when they wanted to do a custom blend with me, it was honestly a no-brainer. I was like, yeah, sign me up. What are we doing? So we came up with the perfect blend for you, the salty chocolate caramel. And guys, it is so good. So many of you guys have been telling me that you've tried it, that you love it, and that you drink it too, and it really works. It doesn't make you groggy the next day like other sleep aids. It helps you fall asleep quickly, stay asleep longer. It has magnesium, L-theanine, reishi, all of the good stuff in it. Now, what I love is that it's this like sweet treat right before I go to sleep. It got 0 added sugar. It's only 15 calories. It's like this nice warm cup of hot cocoa before bed. But what I have been loving is in the summer months pouring it over ice. So then it tastes like this like really good chocolate milk before bed. It's like the perfect dessert and nightcap. Now, we did a very limited run with my custom blend because we weren't sure how it was going to be received, but we sold out, and then we did a reorder, and it's almost gone for real this time. And because Beam is so amazing, they are offering you guys up to 40% off. But like I said, supplies is very limited, so you got to act quickly. Go to my link, use my code 10 to life, get hooked up, change your sleep habits. I'm telling you, the sleep score, it doesn't lie. The flavor is so good. You got to check it out if you have trouble sleeping. And now I am off to bed. Sweet dreams. In August of 2000, the Lundy family was enjoying a very nice, quiet life in Palmerston North, New Zealand. It was a great place for the Lundy family because it had a lot of like relaxed, small town vibes to it, a lot of kid-friendly activities. So in the eyes of the parents of the family, Mark and Christine, it really was perfect. Now, Mark was a very big, tall guy with thick glasses, kind of some thinning brown hair. Christine was short and curvy. She had short blonde hair, blunt bangs. She also wore this large pair of glasses that I feel like everybody kind of wore in the 90s. You know, the ones with like more of like the clear rims. They're kind of square. They're huge. You get it. So Mark and Christine had been married for 17 years at this point. Their marriage had lasted so long because they were such a good fit with one another. They were each other's best friends. They just kind of got each other. And it was interesting because they could talk about everything and they almost never fought, ever. They had one child together, a 7-year-old daughter named Amber. Amber was like this little tiny cute cherub. She had this short, round, little rosy cheeks. She had a similar haircut to her mom. It's like blunt bob with bangs. She was always smiling. She was also very bright, outgoing, strong-willed. All of her teachers even said that she was a model student. They loved having her in their classes. Now, little Amber was involved in Girl Guides, which is the New Zealand equivalent of Girl Scouts. And Mark and Christine often volunteered to help with Amber's Girl Guides group as well. It's a tongue twister, so I'm going to try and say that without screwing up as much as possible. The family was just really this wholesome, close-knit type of family. Mark and Christine owned a kitchen sink business together, and Christine did a lot of the background, like administrative work for the business, while Mark was more like the face of the company and more of the salesman. However, the company wasn't doing working very well because selling kitchen sinks was like a very niche industry, as I'm sure you can imagine. And there wasn't a whole lot of demand for brand new sinks. I mean, think about it. You might impulse buy a new outfit or snacks or even something expensive like a new phone or gadget or something like that. But who's just like randomly on a shopping trip and thinks to themselves like, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to buy a new kitchen sink. And not just any kitchen sink, but this specific kitchen sink. I mean, it's just not really a thing. And the Lundys weren't selling as many sinks as they needed to in order to be successful in this business. So by the late 90s, Mark and Christine were over $100,000 in debt. And it wasn't looking like their business was going to take off anytime soon. So Mark had to find some other way to make money and help support his family. In 1999, Mark purchased 2 plots of land in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand. Now, Hawke's Bay is about a 2-hour drive from where they lived in the north, and it's an area that is known for its wineries. A few people who Mark knew also invested in this property, and they all planned to use this land together to grow grapes. So in Mark's mind, this really was the perfect idea. They would grow grapes, they would sell them to wineries, they would make a killing at it. It was his solution to pay off that massive debt that was coming from that kitchen sink business. However, things didn't really work out that way because Mark wasn't able to make all the payments on the land on time. So instead of making money, now this land was costing him more in terms of late fees. And on top of that, he was also starting to miss payments on his mortgage every month. So all to say, things were not really going great for the Lundy family. When there's financial strain, we know that it often sometimes leads to disaster. So on August 30th, 2000, Mark was in the town of Petone for business. He was doing sales pitches for his sink business, trying to get that up and lively again. And this was a pretty normal move for him. It was a thing that he did a lot, traveling alone to Petone for this exact reason. Meanwhile, Christine and Amber stayed at home. Now, all throughout the morning, Mark tried calling Christine, but nobody was answering their home phone, which, if you remember, landlines back in the early 2000s. Eventually, at 9:20, Christine's friend Karen answered the phone. She said that Christine was busy, but that she would call him back soon. However, by 11:40 a.m., Mark still hadn't heard from Christine, and he was now starting to get pretty worried. So he called his friend Stuart, and he asked him to go and check on her. Well, a little while later, Stuart called Mark, and he was very upset and freaked out. He said that Mark needed to get home immediately. Something was really wrong. So Mark jumped in his car and made the hour-and-a-half drive back to his house, but he couldn't even make it all the way home because his street was completely blocked off. A police officer actually even stopped Mark before he could get to the house and said he had to go to the police station. His wife and his daughter, they were dead. Now, right away, Mark lost it. He was crying, shaking, just very upset. The police didn't think that he was in the right state of mind to drive himself to the police station, so they took his car and Mark rode in a police car back to the station. Once they were at the station, the police officers told Mark everything that had happened so far. That morning, Christine's brother, Glenn, had gone to the Lundy family home. Glenn owned a business too, and he needed some help with some administrative work, something that Christine always helped out with, kitchen sink company. So a few days before, he asked Christine if she would help him with that admin work. She said yes, and they agreed to meet the morning of August 30th. So that morning on August 30th, Glenn first called Christine to make sure that it was still okay for him to come over, but she didn't answer the phone. Now, even though he didn't get the okay or the all clear to come over, he knew that they had agreed in advance to this meeting, so he still made his way over to their home. Now, Glenn hardly ever used the front door, so this time, like usual, he just went around the back to let himself in. Except when he got to the back door, which was a sliding glass door, it was wide open, and he couldn't hear any noise coming from inside the house. Now, this was creepy, of course. But Glenn went inside and he yelled, "Hello, hello," a few times, but nobody answered. He sort of started wandering around for a little while trying to find anybody, and that's when he then stumbled across something horrifying in the hallway. A small girl in a nightgown was lying on the floor. She also wasn't moving. He checked her pulse, but there was nothing. Glenn was sure that it was Amber, but it was very hard to tell because this little girl's face, it was horribly mutilated. It looked like she had been hit in the head over and over and over. Amber was lying right outside of Mark and Christine's bedroom, so when Glenn then looked into their room, he saw Christine lying in her bed. She was face up, naked, and also not moving at all. Her head had also been very badly beaten. I mean, there was blood everywhere. So Glenn was freaking out like we all would be, right? He called for emergency help and he sat at the dining table while he waited for them to arrive. Sadly, once the paramedics did arrive to the house, both Christine and Amber were pronounced as dead. Over the next couple of hours, the street was just closed down completely, the house was roped off, and the police started investigating the scene. There was blood everywhere in that hallway and that bedroom. This beating and murder was so bad that parts of Christine's brain and shards of her skull were smeared all over the walls and the furniture. There was even a huge piece of brain matter on the ceiling. Now, as for Amber, like I said, her body was found in the doorway of the bedroom. Literally in it. Her feet were in the room and her head was in the hallway. It was almost as though she had walked in on her mom being beaten or killed, and then she went to run away, but the killer attacked her from behind. And while this was obviously a horrifying thing to find, almost nothing else about the home was wrong. Christine's jewelry box was missing, and there was one window with a broken latch and a small bloodstain on it, but no other real serious damage. Still, it seemed unlikely that this was a robbery gone wrong. I mean, Christine and Amber's bodies were so severely beaten that this crime, it seemed personal. So after Mark showed up outside of his home trying to get back in and the police told him all of this and took him to the station, he was obviously very upset. He had a very difficult time keeping himself together. Eventually, he calmed himself down enough for the police officers to ask him some questions, like where he was the previous evening, and he told them. I mean, he had a really good alibi because he was in this completely different town doing sink sales. He also told them about his relationship with Christine. It was good. They loved each other. They were in a happy marriage for almost 2 decades. He said that they were the type of couple that was so affectionate that they often grossed out their other family members and even their friends because they just had this massive amount of PDA all the time. They weren't having any issues, none whatsoever. However, later, Mark did admit that he and Christine hadn't had sex in a pretty long time. This conflicted with the previous story that he told them about being overly affectionate. I mean, sort of. I guess you can be very touchy-feely in public without that translating to a lot of activity in the bedroom. I don't know. But it's also possible that all of that hand-holding and other things that they were doing around their friends, maybe it was just for show. This was also not a great indication that their relationship was as great as he said. Not that sex has to be the end-all, be-all of a good relationship, but again, it was just this little hint that maybe Mark and Christine weren't as strong and as happy as they acted like. And it seemed like this was going to start to be a little bit of a domino effect, because once Mark admitted that their sex life wasn't the best, he also confessed that he had hired a sex worker the previous night, possibly right around the time of the murders, and the sex worker's name was Belinda. He told the police that he did this pretty often, as a matter of fact, and it wasn't like it was this one-off moment of weakness for him. Mark said that on the night of the 29th, he had read a book, drank half a bottle of rum, called this escort agency, and that Belinda arrived at his hotel around 11 p.m. and then left around 1 a.m. He then checked out of his hotel around 8 a.m. He says he tried to call Christine multiple times, but she didn't answer, so he ended up leaving a message and just kind of went on with his day, went to a few of those work meetings. Police were able to corroborate this story as well. I guess the one silver lining on cheating with your wife the night before she's brutally murdered is that you have a witness who can say that you were with them and you have an alibi. However, the police still thought that Mark's story was a little off, though, mostly because he had lied about he and Christine's sex life. Why lie? Because he had an alibi, they ended up just writing it off as the husband who was embarrassed that he and his wife didn't have sex and that he cheated. However, with this alibi, there was no reason to treat him as a suspect. It was rock solid. It was ironclad. So they kept investigating. And while they were investigating, they weren't very open with the public about how the case was going. They did announce that Christine and Amber died from being hit in the head with a heavy weapon, something maybe like a tomahawk, but they couldn't find anything that matched that description. Not in the house or anywhere near it. They did find that Christine and Amber had very little tiny flecks of paint in their hair, though, which coincidentally was the same color as the paint that Mark used to mark his tools. In fact, in Mark's tool shed, the detectives saw that all of his tools had paint on them. Apparently, this was Mark's way of putting his name on his tools to identify that he owned them in case a friend or somebody else maybe borrowed them. But even in the shed, the detectives couldn't find anything like a tomahawk or possibly even a small axe, because that was something they were considering. So police started sending dive teams to a river nearby. but they found nothing. I mean, wherever the murder weapon was, it had not been dumped at or near the scene of the crime. They did decide that they didn't think that this crime was sexually motivated either, which was a little strange considering that Christine was naked when she was found. I mean, maybe it was normal for her to sleep naked, but it seemed like something maybe the police needed to investigate more. But one thing that the police knew for sure was that they did not suspect Mark. They said he was being cooperative the entire time and again had that ironclad alibi. However, like we see in a lot of cases, rumors started to spread. And the rumor particularly that started to spread was that Mark was in fact the killer, even though the police adamantly said that that wasn't true. But these rumors just got worse and worse and kind of erupted at Christine and Amber's funeral. The funeral was held on September 7th, 2000. Mark was super emotional and noticeably upset the entire time. All through the service, he cried very, very loudly. And when everybody was supposed to stand up, he had a difficult time getting to his feet. When it was over and he needed to walk to his car, he ended up needing help from his family and friends just to get there. And people all had very different reactions to all of this. Some people thought that it showed just how truly sad and devastated he was and how powerful his grief was. I mean, his wife and child were literally murdered in a very bloody, gruesome way. I think any one of us would be just completely besides ourselves in that situation. However, other people thought that Mark was performing, like his emotions were so over the top that they seemed fake. Some footage of Mark at the funeral even started circulating on the news, and it just made these rumors so much worse. Lots of people are now saying that Mark was the killer, even though the police didn't see him as a suspect. In fact, it got so bad that the police had to get on TV again and announce once more they did not consider Mark a suspect. Specifically, they clarified he was a victim too in all of this. However, that wasn't necessarily true at all. Because if you remember, I said at the very beginning that Mark called Christine the morning of August 30th and that her friend Karen answered. Karen told Mark that Christine was busy and she would call him back. Well, it turns out that Karen had planned on going and seeing Christine that morning, and she had walked right into the house when Glenn discovered the bodies. When Karen answered Mark's phone call, the police were already at the home. They actually coached Karen to tell him that Christine was busy and would call him back. It's not clear why they did this exactly, but in my mind, they wouldn't have told her to lie unless maybe they suspected Mark of something. They wanted to get him back and question him in person. Maybe didn't want to give him any time to prepare or flee. The police had also searched Mark's belongings and found that on the night of August 29th, Mark made 2 phone calls. One was at 5:30 p.m. and the other was around 8:30 p.m. But during those 3 hours in between, Mark's phone was inactive and his whereabouts were completely unknown. His phone wasn't off necessarily, but it suddenly didn't have any activity on it for 3 hours. No calls, no messages sent, no quickly turning the phone on to see what time it was, nothing. And this didn't match up with Mark's usual phone activity, not at all. So naturally, the police found this very suspicious. Especially when a neighbor of the Lundy family named Margaret Dance came forward and said that she saw something weird around 7:15 the night of the murder. She said that she was getting ready to leave her home around 7 p.m. She was going to choir practice, but a few of her friends stopped by to talk. They were there for about 15 minutes and then they left. Margaret then went outside to get into her car, and she saw somebody running down the street. It was a heavyset person wearing what looked to be some sort of jumpsuit, and this person also had curly blonde hair. However, as the person got closer, Margaret said that she realized that it was actually a man wearing a blonde wig. He looked upset, he looked scared, and he ran right by Margaret without saying a word. Now, aside from the wig, Margaret thought that it looked a lot like Mark, but she couldn't say for sure or not if it was him. The police also searched Mark's car. They also found a purple and navy striped polo shirt. It was inside out and it was stuffed in a suitcase. Mark said that he had worn that shirt on the night of the 29th, but when the forensic examiners analyzed the shirt, they discovered 2 tiny stains on it, one on the chest pocket and the other on the left sleeve. And the entire shirt was tested for DNA, and obviously Mark's DNA was found on the shirt, but so was somebody else's, specifically Christine's. Now, this wasn't an immediate red flag or anything because Mark and Christine were married. They lived together. There were lots of innocent ways that Mark could have gotten her DNA on him, like giving her a hug or bumping into her or something like that. At least that would be the case if not for the fact that one of the stains almost looked mucusy, like Mark had used the shirt to wipe his nose, which, gross, I know. Except the experts didn't know for sure if that mucus really was from his nose or if maybe it was something else. So they called in more people to try to figure out what this stain actually was. Specifically, a pathologist from Texas named Dr. Rodney Miller was called in to do testing on these two stains. Now, like I said, the stains were small, very small. The mucusy stain was maybe bigger than a grain of sand, but it was smaller than a grain of rice, so that gives you an idea of what that size truly was. So Dr. Miller used a very specific technique to do his testing. It's called immunohistochemistry, also known as IHC, and he used it to test the stains. And the results of this test were about to change everything entirely, because the results said that that tiny speck stain of mucus, it didn't come from a runny nose. It didn't come from maybe somebody's eye or a tear. No, it came from Christine's brain matter. Now, it's easy to explain DNA away for hugging, like we said, or transfer DNA if you're around them. How do you explain having your partner, your spouse's brain matter on you when you were never allowed in even to the crime scene because it was all blocked off? How'd you get that on your shirt? It's not looking good. However, if you're like me, you'd probably be thinking that it would be strange for Mark to only have a couple of tiny stains on his shirt if he did in fact kill Christine and Amber. I mean, after all, the crime scene was a complete disaster, a mess, blood everywhere. So you would think that he would have ended up completely covered in blood and that there would be multiple stains. He'd have blood, brains, everything all over him. So 2 little grain of sand or grain of rice sized stains just doesn't feel like that's all he would get on his clothing if he was involved. But the police figured that Mark was probably wearing some sort of coveralls or jumpsuit or something like that. And remember, Margaret said that the person she saw running was wearing some sort of jumpsuit. However, you also have to take into consideration that Mark was in Petone that night, a whole different town entirely. So one theory that the police came up with was that Mark may have killed Christine and Amber during that 3-hour window, that 3-hour period of time where his phone was inactive. He called Christine around 5:30. They spoke for 8 minutes. She told Mark that she was taking Amber to McDonald's for dinner. Then 3 hours went by with no activity on his phone. At 8:28, he called a business partner. They talked for a little while about their wine vineyard type business. A receipt that the police found at the Lundy house showed that Christine did go to McDonald's around 5:45 p.m. that evening, not long after she got off the phone with Mark. Her cell phone records also showed that she had a very short phone call with a friend at 7 p.m., so the thought was that she must have died shortly after that phone call. A forensic evidence would also support all of this because during their autopsies, the coroner looked at what was inside of Christine and Amber's stomachs, and there wasn't much gastric fluid or stomach acid. Which, to get a little technical here, it can take the stomach 2 to 5 hours to fully digest a meal. And throughout that time, more and more acid is leaked into the stomach. Now, because there was so little acid in Christine and Amber's stomach, the coroner concluded that they were in the beginning stages of stomach digestion. So the coroner determined that Christine and Amber died about an hour after eating, sometime between 7 to 7:15 p.m. on August 29th. And that was right in the middle of that window where the police could not find anything on Mark's phone. So it was possible that Mark had driven back to Palmerston North and killed Amber and Christine, and then made his way back to the other town, right? In fact, Mark even bought gas on the 29th, and his gas consumption lined up with driving to Palmerston North to kill Amber and Christine, and then driving back to Petone for the night, then having enough still to drive back home the following morning. Now, what I mean by that is the receipt showed how much gas Mark bought. Police looked at his gas gauge when he came back to Palmerston North, and it showed his gas levels being very, very low. Too low, considering he had just bought gas the day before if he only made the one trip. But if he made the multiple trip, that would make sense. Now, as for that broken window latch and the missing jewelry box, police were now thinking that he did all of that to make it look like a burglary had gone wrong. Then, after killing his whole family, he could have gotten rid of the murder weapon, the coveralls, the blonde wig, then drove back to his hotel in Petone. He hired a sex worker to corroborate that he was at his hotel late that night, and then he checked out of his hotel the next morning. Now, Mark would have had to work very, very fast to get all of that done in 3 hours. Remember, it was almost an hour and a half drive from one town to the other, so the trip alone would have taken up most of that window of time, the 3-hour unaccounted for activity time. But in addition to that, Mark would have had to drive during rush hour traffic and go way over the speed limit to make it happen. The police did some testing and they realized that it was possible to make the trip in 3 hours, but only if Mark was speeding. And they actually replicated the drive and they made that trip from town to town in an hour and 33 minutes. They said that it could have been done even faster, but never quite managed to pull it off in any of those tests. So of course, as they were investigating, the big question was, why would Mark do this in the first place? What was the motive? Well, the police suspected that all it had to do with was money. I mentioned before how badly in debt Mark was, and the investigators discovered that on August 28th, just one day before the murders, Mark got a notice that he needed to make a payment on that land for that vineyard. If he didn't make the payment, he would lose that land entirely. On top of that, 5 days before Christine's murder, Mark and Christine had signed papers to increase her life insurance policy, an increase of $200,000 to $500,000. Meanwhile, Mark didn't change the terms of his policy, only hers. And I just gotta say, I love it when criminals are this dumb, right? Or when alleged criminals are this dumb, because we're gonna get to that. But if you're planning on murdering somebody, first of all, you shouldn't change their life insurance policy, period. That's a huge red flag. But like days before the murder, you're just asking to get caught, right? Or maybe not. Maybe it all is a big coincidence. We'll see. So the big payout obviously didn't come through because the policy was only effective once Christine and Mark received the official documents, which they hadn't yet. Still, the police figured that Mark probably didn't realize this, that he might have murdered her in the hopes of getting all of the money that he needed, only to then realize after the fact that he moved too fast, that he screwed himself out of this big payout. Either way, they felt like they had enough evidence. So in February of 2001, Mark was arrested for the murder of Christine and Amber, and he was denied bail and his trial was set for 2002. During the trial, the prosecution said that Mark killed his wife for insurance money, that he hadn't wanted to kill his daughter Amber, but that she must have witnessed the murder, and then Mark realized he had no other choice but to kill her too. They argued that Mark drove from his hotel to Palmerston North between 5:30 and 8:30 p.m. on August 29th. He drove at what they called a breakneck speed, committed the murders, staged the scene to look like a robbery, threw away any evidence, and then went back to his hotel. They also mentioned that it was a little weird for Christine to be in bed naked, especially so early in the day. She and Amber usually watched their favorite show at 7, and Amber would go to bed shortly afterward. Christine would stay up for then a little while longer, but there was no reason for her to need to be undressed in bed so early. I mean, at least not usually. Well, the prosecution argued that when Mark called Christine at 5:30, he told her that he was driving home for the night and that they would have sex. He specifically told Christine to be naked in the bed, ready and waiting for him. Which I am just going to say, I feel like that is a kind of a strange argument, right? Especially because we know that Mark and Christine didn't really have any sort of sex life according to him. You would think that Christine would think a request like that would be pretty weird in and of itself, and maybe that would even make her suspicious, more than Mark just saying he was coming home because he forgot something that he needed to grab or something like that. But I don't know, who knows? This was what the prosecution team thought fit the evidence the best. They also brought up the fact that Mark had a shirt with Christine's brain matter on it. Both Amber and Christine also had paint in their hair that matched the paint on Mark's tools, and the time of their death matched up with that period of inactivity on Mark's phone. The neighbor Margaret also took the stand, and she recounted what she saw that night. A man dressed like a woman running down the street, and that man looked awful lot like Mark. But they also kind of hurt their own argument, though, by sharing some evidence that didn't really line up with their whole theory and timeline. See, some police officers learned that Christine's computer was shut off at 10:52 p.m. on the night of August 29th. This was after Christine and Amber were supposedly killed, and it was when the police knew for a fact that Mark was back at his hotel room. But the prosecution said that the computer's files showed evidence of it being tampered with. Everything was apparently just disorganized. They thought that the computer was actually shut down much earlier, but then Mark went in and changed the settings and the time on the computer to make it look like it was turned off way later, sort of covering his tracks. but it sounded like a little bit of a stretch to me. I don't know. What do you think? In any event, Mark took the stand for himself, and he said that he did not kill Christine or Amber, that he would never do something like that, and he was very adamant that he was not involved in either of their deaths. After both sides rested, the jury ended up deliberating for 7 hours, and in the end, they found Mark guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he wouldn't be eligible for parole for the first 17 years. But this was far from over. Mark's defense immediately worked to appeal his conviction. Then, 4 months later, their appeal was denied, and Mark's non-parole period actually increased from 17 years to 20 years. He was basically being punished by the court for having committed such a gruesome crime and then trying to appeal it. But that wasn't the end. I mean, like I said before, the whole timeline that the police came up with where Mark committed those murders and did all of those other things to cover his tracks, it didn't add up. Earlier, there had been all of these rumors going around that Mark did it. And now people were starting to think the very opposite, that there was actually no way in hell that he could have pulled that off. See, there was some other evidence that came out during his trial that really did make it look like Mark was potentially innocent. And I'm not going to lie, the timeline that the prosecution laid out doesn't really sound possible. Mark's lawyer said the same thing. They didn't see how he could drive to the house and back to the hotel in 3 hours. It took the police even longer than that to make the drive. So what gives? Not to mention actually committing the murder itself. I mean, getting rid of the evidence, reprogramming the computer. It's a lot to cram in into just a couple of minutes. And the police never found anything other than that shirt linking Mark to the crime. They didn't find the weapon, Christine's missing jewelry box, a jumpsuit, a blonde wig like Margaret had said she saw the man wearing. They also said that the police would have found way more blood and brain matter in Mark's car and on his clothing if he really was the killer. The only DNA evidence they found on Mark was the 2 tiny stains on his shirt. They also argued that the method that the pathologist used to test if the stain was brain matter was completely unreliable. At one point, it even came out that the pathologist who proved that it was Christine's brain matter, Dr. Miller, had used faulty science. In fact, brain cells usually break down really fast, and the shirt wasn't tested until months after Christine and Amber had died. Multiple other pathologists said that there was no actual way to tell if the stain was brain matter or not. It could have been some other kind of DNA from Christine, something Mark got from brushing against her or hugging her, like we said before. So now you might be thinking, okay, Annie, well, what about that insurance policy? He increased hers, he didn't increase his own. Well, it turns out he wanted to increase his own life insurance policy, but he had a lot of pre-existing health conditions that made it impossible for him to do so. Plus, in February of 2009, 7 long years after Mark got sentenced and sent to prison, an article was published that changed the way a lot of people thought about the Lundy murders. It was titled, "The Lundy Murders, What the Jury Didn't Hear." And as you can probably guess from that title, this article was full of information that had not publicly come to light before, and it also was not presented, obviously, at the trial. For example, the pathologist who determined that Christine and Amber had died at 7:15 p.m. had used a very unreliable method to come to his conclusion. Another pathologist explained that there are a lot of things that can affect somebody's digestion. Things like what medications you're taking, how stressed out you feel, the kind of lifestyle you live, it can all make the digestion process slower. So the fact that Amber and Christine didn't have that much fluid in their stomachs, it didn't mean anything in terms of figuring out the timeline. There was no way to say how long it would have actually taken them to digest the McDonald's. In general, it's hard to determine when exactly someone died, but the pathologist didn't even do the bare minimum. He never even checked the stages of the bodies to see what stage of rigor mortis they were in, and he also didn't check their temperatures. The article also argued that Margaret, the neighbor who saw the man in the blonde wig, was completely unreliable and told a false story. And apparently, the police knew that. See, Margaret was 60 years old and claimed to be a psychic with a photographic memory, something that, in spite of what you might have seen in movies or TV shows, it does not exist. Nobody has a photographic memory. And frankly, if she did have a photographic memory, you would think that she could remember what the person running towards her looked like. But she admitted to police that it wasn't super fresh and it was still a little bit fuzzy. So draw whatever conclusions you want about how reliable she was or was not. And you still might be thinking, okay, Annie, she might have exaggerated about some things, but that doesn't mean that she straight up lied to the police. Not to mention, a lot of people do believe in psychic powers, and maybe Margaret actually thought she had some. It's also possible that she might have had a better than average memory, even if it wasn't actually photographic. Maybe she thought that it was, or photogenic, or whatever. We don't actually know that she was purposefully, genuinely dishonest. Except, Margaret said that her friends came to visit her around 7 p.m. But that wasn't true. Some detectives interviewed these friends, and they said that they were at Margaret's house around 6 p.m., and that they were only there for 10 minutes. They added in that they were at a grocery store and then went to Margaret's house right afterward. The grocery store that they were at was closing, and it always closes around 6. That's how they knew that they were at Margaret's house around 6 p.m. So the police checked surveillance cameras at the grocery store, and they saw that the owners were locking up the store around 6:30, meaning that Margaret's friends were long gone by that point and had already gone to visit her. The article also pointed out that multiple other pieces of evidence didn't match the idea that Christine and Amber were killed around 7 p.m. For example, some neighbors said that they saw lights on in the house around 11 p.m., which was normal. Christine was generally still up at this time. They also noticed that the lights were turned off the next morning, so it's not like the light had just been left on after the murders if it happened earlier that evening. Also, like I mentioned before, Christine's computer said that it was turned off at 10:52 p.m., which again was part of Christine's normal routine. She usually stayed up late, searching the internet, watching TV before going to bed around 11 or midnight. And you'll remember that during Mark's trial, the prosecution argued that he intentionally changed the settings on the computer to make the shutoff time look different. But this would have been pretty difficult to do. Even for an experienced hacker, it's not something that is very simple to do, and Mark just wasn't a computer guy. There was nothing to even suggest that he had that kind of knowledge. Now, as for the fact that a lot of the files were messed up, like if somebody had gone in and changed a bunch of things around, well, at one point, a computer technician looked at the computer and found that it had a virus which was messing the files up on the computer. It was doing it all on its own, not any calculated hacker coming in. The article also mentioned that the paint flecks that were found in Christine and Amber's hair were never proven to be exactly the same paint as the ones on Mark's tools. It looked like it was a similar color, but the police couldn't even prove that it was the same shade, let alone the same brand and everything else. But what makes everything even more suspicious, more than anything else, is that the police had multiple other suspects. People who didn't even have alibis that could be corroborated. But the detectives never looked into them all that closely for whatever reason. So after this article was published, many people thought that the wrong person was behind bars. A group of college students even tried to recreate Mark's drive to and from Palmerston North just to sort of prove how little sense the official story made. They nicknamed their test the Lundy 500 or the Lundy 300. However, this was eventually called off as it seemed very distasteful and there was a lot of outrage coming from the public regarding it. Nevertheless, shortly after the article was published, Mark's defense team brought another appeal. They brought this one to something called the Judicial Privy Council, which was the final court of appeal in New Zealand. Basically, it was his last chance to clear his name, or Mark would lose his chance at freedom forever. So the council heard his argument in 2013.
The Crown have rejected claims by Mark Lundy's defence team that coverage of his behaviour at the funeral of his wife and daughter led jurors to convict him. Lundy wants the Court of Appeal to overturn his convictions for murdering his family in 2000. Ben Irwin has been in court.
The Crown says it's enormously wide of the mark for Mark Lundy's lawyers to claim his dead wife's brain tissue was not on his shirt.
Is that from those two separate pieces of tissue found in different places on the appellant's shirt was the DNA of the deceased Christine Lundy.
The brain tissue evidence was a key factor in Mark Lundy's second trial in 2015, when he was again found guilty of the 2000 murder of his wife Christine and daughter Amber in their Palmerston North home. Lundy is not in court to watch the appeal, in which his legal team has attacked the brain tissue testing, calling it novel, experimental, and labelling Lundy a scientific guinea pig. But Crown lawyer Philip Morgan says multiple experts agree
that this was the brain tissue of Christine Lundy.
Morgan also rejecting claims by Lundy's lawyers that images filmed by media of his behaviour at his family's funeral unfairly swayed the jury. He drew attention to other forensic evidence, including paint fragments found in the victims, which matched the paint on Lundy's hand tools.
In Christine Lundy's case, particularly significant is that the paint was actually sort of driven into a bone chip from her skull.
This appeal was scheduled to finish today, but longer than expected submissions from Lundy's team will see it continue through till tomorrow. Ben Irwin, News Hub.
Well, Mark won the appeal, and he was approved to have a retrial. While he waited for his new day in court, Mark was actually released on bail for 18 months. Many of his family members were so relieved by this. They had been supporting Mark this entire time. They didn't believe that he had anything to do with these murders.
Mark Lundy's been given a get-out-of-jail card after 12 years behind bars.
He's been freed ahead of his retrial for the murder of his wife and daughter. A judge at the High Court in Wellington this afternoon ruled he should get bail. Simon Bradwell was in court. He joins us now live. Simon.
Good evening. Yes, 12 years Mark Lundy was behind bars. He wasn't even allowed out when his father died. But after a 45-minute hearing today, he's out of jail tonight. Mark Lundy didn't get bail ahead of his first murder trial. This time he has. High Court Judge Ronald Young deciding Mark Lundy can be released from his cell at Rangipo Prison in the central North Island after 12 years behind bars, to the joy of his supporters.
Everyone's really happy about the whole thing. So, yeah, I'm just excited to be able to see him outside of a visiting room. I'll just give him a big hug and, yeah.
Well, we broke the news of the decision to one of Christine Lundy's closest friends.
Oh my God, it's the last thing that we wanted. It really was. Yeah, we're hoping the angels were out there today, you know, helping us.
Rules around bail hearings mean we can only reveal the decision and conditions imposed by the judge. Mark Lundy is bailed to a Taupō address, details of which are suppressed. He must not contact anyone who gave evidence at his first trial, and he must report to police once a week.
I'm not sure it's for me to comment on the conditions, but I can't see anything objectionable in the conditions.
Lundy wasn't present and there was no video link to his jail.
I would hope that he'd be let out straight away, but obviously there's processes that have to be gone through.
Around 30 people sat in the gallery for the hearing. It's unknown if opponents of bail were among them.
Nothing surprises me now. I mean, he's been granted a retrial, and so nothing surprises me now with the justice system.
Today's ruling following the decision by the Privy Council to throw out Mark Lundy's convictions for murdering his wife Christine and daughter Amber 13 years ago.
That the convictions should be quashed and that the appellant should stand trial again on the charges of murder as soon as that can be conveniently arranged.
So in the spring of 2015, Mark's second trial began. This time, the prosecution was arguing that Mark had actually killed Christine and Amber in the early morning hours of August 30th, after the sex worker had left his hotel room at 1 a.m. This meant that they dropped the entire theory that Mark had changed the time on the computer. And that wasn't the only strategy that they changed either. I mean, in light of all this new information that had just come out, they needed to change course. So the prosecution didn't have Margaret, the neighbor, testify this time around either. Aside from those changes, the prosecution's argument stayed relatively the same as what they had said in the first trial. The defense, on the other hand, brought up a lot of evidence that had not come up during the first trial, like how the police found fingerprints, palm prints, and footprints at the scene of the crime that did not match Mark. The defense said that these could have come from the real killer, somebody who was not Mark. They had some of Mark and Christine's friends testify too, and many of them said they hadn't noticed any tension between the two of them in the days leading up to the murder. However, Mark and Christine's house cleaner testified that when she was at the house on the 28th, she did feel a lot of tension between the couple. She testified that she was too scared to even look at Mark because things just seemed so tense and so stressed. But the defense brought up a statement that she gave to the police right after the murders. And in this statement, she said that she saw a white car drive past Christine and Mark's house on August 28th. This stood out to her because the car was driving very slowly. She said that she saw two men in the front seat and a woman in the back. When the defense pushed her about it, she backtracked, though, from her original statement, said that she could barely remember the car and that it wasn't an important detail after all. A neighbor of Mark and Christine's also testified that he was outside talking to his father around 11 p.m. He noticed that the motion security light had turned on outside of Mark and Christine's house. Then he said when he finished up his call around midnight, he heard the sound of smashing glass. Plus, the defense brought up that both Christine and Amber had a lot of defensive wounds on their body. They each also had the DNA of 2 unidentified males underneath their fingernails. The DNA was never matched to Mark, and the police weren't able to determine who it belonged to. Also, when Christine was found, she had a wad of hair in her hand, 21 strands of hair to be exact, and the hair did not belong to Mark, but nobody determined whose hair it was. Except now the defense presented a theory about who the real killer could be: Christine's brother. Now remember, Glenn was the one who discovered the bodies, and he was the one who called the police. During the call, he told the operator that Amber had gaping head injuries, and the defense argued that the only reason that Glenn knew that she had gaping head injuries was because he was the real one who hit her in the head. When the police arrived at the scene, they saw that Glenn had a large, fresh scratch on his nose as well. Glenn said that he thought it could have been from a cat, but he couldn't remember. He said it was from a while ago and it had just scabbed over. However, he said it looked fresh because he was known to be picking at his scabs. However, I'm sure you guys can see why that is suspicious, especially knowing about the defensive wounds and the DNA under Christine's nails. Now, the police did do a search of Glenn's home and car at the beginning of their investigation. They used luminol in both places, and they found blood each time. In his car, blood was found on the driver's seat and in his trunk. They even found traces of blood in his home, and the blood was an 83% match to Christine and an 88% match to Amber. Glenn's roommate even came forward and said that he had suspected him all along. The roommate even went searching through Glenn's dirty clothing to see if he could find anything with blood on it, which he did. A bloody towel, a bloody handkerchief, and a bloody pair of underwear. These were all on the floor of the bathroom on the day that Amber and Christine were murdered. But why would Glenn want to kill them, his own sister, his own niece? Well, the defense argued that it was because he was preying on Amber and sexually harming her. Christine found out, so he killed both of them. A different teen relative of Glenn's also accused him of sexual assault, and the defense then argued that he was doing that same thing to Amber. However, I want to be clear, there was no evidence that was found to prove this theory. One of the defense's main points of the argument was that the prosecution could not prove that the stain on Mark's polo shirt was from Christine's brain. They argued that the prosecution had consulted numerous pathologists, all of whom refused to testify. They could not, in good conscience, say that the stain was from brain matter. Dr. Miller, that same pathologist who originally said that Mark had Christine's brain matter on his shirt, even took the stand virtually and admitted that the lab that he used wasn't set up to test forensic evidence. In fact, the method that he used, the IHC, it was a faulty testing method that can't be trusted. So basically, he admitted that he had made a lot of mistakes with those results. He pushed back a little on the idea that brain cells would have been broken down before he could test them, though. He said he did a little experiment where he took some animal brain cells and put them on a shirt, and he was still able to test them a year later. But the defense still argued that he was wrong. Dr. Miller was using bad science and flawed research. And I have to say, it's crazy to me that a lot of this evidence was not brought up until the second trial. The DNA under the fingernails, the footprints, the fingerprints, suspicions of Glenn, all of these things. To me, this seems like very important evidence that should have come out right at the very beginning. Better late than never, I guess, but come on. So this time around, after the trial ended, the jury deliberated for over 15 hours. At the end, they still found Mark guilty of killing Christine and Amber. The prosecution, representing Amber and Christine's family, made a statement outside of the court regarding their feelings about the decision.
The police welcome the guilty verdict against Mark Lundy for the 30th of August 2000 murders of Christine and Amber Lundy in their home address in Palmerston North. This has been a particularly tumultuous and stressful time for the families of Christine and Amber. This verdict by no way makes up for the loss and the grief and the sorrow, but I hope that at some level the family can gain some closure from this. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Crown and the police investigation team for the last 18 months, diligent and committed investigation and preparation for this retrial. The police have reviewed all the evidence, gathered it for court and presented it by way of the Crown for the jury to make their decision today, and we are happy with their decision.
Nearly 15 years later, Mark Lundy was retried for the murder of his wife and daughter, and yesterday was found guilty.
He's guilty, and I think he's exactly where he needs to be, and I hope they throw the key away.
Today at the Karamea Crescent house, there's no obvious sign that a tragedy ever occurred here.
People move in and move out, because I've had neighbours there about 3 or 4 times.
The current owners have told One News that they have been trying to sell this property for the past 6 years, but the publicity surrounding the case has scared off potential buyers. The case that went to trial, the Court of Appeal, the Privy Council and back to the High Court has taken a toll on the victim's family and friends.
He doesn't show any remorse, he doesn't believe that he has done it. So there's no emotion. So, yeah, it's just unbelievable.
Christine Lundy's brother, Glenn Wiggery, who gave evidence during the lengthy retrial, described it as a sometimes harrowing 2 months. He praised the original police investigation, saying, "The verdict backs up everything you did so long ago. Well done, you got it right." He hoped it meant some closure and that the most important people in all of this, Christine and Amber, have justice and can finally rest in peace.
More and more in these cases, defence teams are left with very little but to attack the integrity of the police officers. And the really good thing about this case is that the police officers' integrity was upheld.
After 18 months on bail, Lundy is back behind bars, serving the remaining 8 years of a 2-decade sentence for murder before he'll be eligible for parole. One News understands he's now in Remutaka prison, but Corrections refuses to confirm this. His defence team has a month to decide on whether to make an appeal.
Mark's defence team tried to appeal again in 2017. This time they brought their appeal to the Supreme Court. Previously, the Privy Council was the highest court of appeal, but since Mark's appeal with the Privy Council, laws have changed and the Supreme Court now can be the final court of appeal, meaning that Mark could try to appeal once again. They argued that the methods used to test the shirt with the brain matter were faulty. However, his conviction was still upheld, so that was it. Mark had no more chances to prove his innocence. All he could do now was sit in prison and wait until he became eligible for parole in August of 2022. His first parole board hearing came after he had spent about 20 years in jail. And if you're on the side of thinking that he's innocent in all of this and you're hoping that this was finally his chance to get out and get free, I have some bad news for you. He was denied parole because the board was concerned that Mark didn't have any plans to address his triggers that may cause him to offend again. Mark was adamant that he didn't need a plan because he had never even committed a crime, so how could he address triggers if he didn't have any? His second parole board hearing was in May of 2023. The board asked him what his motivation was for the murders, but Mark said he didn't have any motivations. He isn't the one who committed any of these crimes, which in almost a repeat of the last hearing meant that he was denied parole. Besides the whole motivation back and forth, the parole board also said that Mark clearly had an alcohol issue that he had not addressed and that he had no safety plan. So after this hearing, Mark started attending treatment for his drinking. Now, of course, if he did it, I can see why it would look like a problem that he was still playing innocent and refusing to take any responsibility. It's good to point out issues he could fix with alcohol and to ask him to explain why he committed the murders and how he would avoid doing it in the future. But if he was innocent, the parole board was basically putting him in a no-win situation, telling him that the only way to get freedom was to provide information that he didn't have and fix problems that never existed. Was he innocent, and could he not share remorse and reasoning for why he wouldn't be a threat to society any longer? Or was he guilty and still just having no remorse and taking it to his grave? To this day, people are still arguing about whether or not Mark is guilty. Many people think that Glenn did it, and others are convinced that it was somebody else entirely. For example, apparently the day of the murders, Mark got a call from one of his business partners. This person told Mark that a creditor had just called him and threatened his life, and he told Mark to be on the lookout. So there are some people who think that this creditor sent somebody to the Lundy house, to teach Mark a lesson. but then things went horribly wrong when they realized that Mark wasn't there. Basically, they didn't mean to kill Christine and Amber at first, and the murders were just a terrible mistake. However, the police did look into this theory and found the person who made the call. They offered this person immunity if they admitted to the crime, but they denied having anything to do with Christine and Amber's murder. Other people say that Christine had an old coworker who she apparently had a lot of issues with. Apparently, this person also had an extremely violent past. The police talked to this person too, and they refused to give the detectives their DNA, which I don't think is necessarily suspicious, but I do think it is important to note. I will say it seems like there were a lot of potential suspects that were not looked into very thoroughly, but it also does seem that Mark had a financial motive to murder Christine. The question is whether all of that debt was enough to make him want to kill his wife and his child in this horrific, barbaric, brutal attack. I mean, it isn't like we haven't seen this exact scenario before, unfortunately, because unfortunately, killing someone for a life insurance policy is sort of cliche for a reason. I've lost track of how many times I've covered a murder where that was the exact motive right here on this channel. But I want to know your thoughts. Do you think that Mark is guilty? Or do you think that the police have ignored potential suspects? Do you think that this could have been the brother Glenn? Comment below and let me know what you guys think. I'm interested to hear your theories as to who and why and the when and what you guys kind of put together, how you piece this whole puzzle together. So let me know. All right, thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode. I apologize if my voice was a little hoarse the entire episode. I am coming down with something, but hopefully I'll recover soon. But anyways, I know it was a little raspier than usual. Before you head out, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel really quickly so that you don't miss new case updates and new exciting news that I'm going to be sharing pretty soon. And yeah, until the next one, stay safe. Bye.